Have you ever felt like your own ego is the biggest obstacle standing between you and the life you want? That no matter how hard you try, you seem stuck in patterns that hold you back from growing and changing? In this eye-opening video, we'll uncover the true nature of the ego and how it can become an invisible prison that keeps your mind captive to fear and resistance to change. Get ready for a deep dive into psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience to understand the mechanisms that make our ego act as a strict gatekeeper of the status quo. Why is the unknown so frightening? How does the need for control block your growth? And most importantly, how can you start dismantling these internal barriers to finally break free? Here, you'll discover practical strategies to recognize these psychological chains and turn your fear into fuel for personal evolution. It's not just about changing. It's about becoming truly free, authentic, and at peace with yourself. If you're ready to break the cycle of stagnation, expand your awareness, and experience deep transformation, this video is your first step. Watch until the end, reflect, and share it with anyone who needs to awaken to this liberating truth. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more content that will help you better understand your mind and advance on your journey of self-discovery. Now, tell me, what's the biggest fear your ego has ever created for you? Leave your comment. Let's share ideas and grow together. How the ego is formed, the construction of identity and its traps. The ego isn't something we're born with. It's built brick by brick during the early years of life. It's like a psychological mask we start wearing to survive, to adapt, and to be accepted in the environment we grow up in. As a child begins to notice which behaviors are rewarded and which are punished, they learn to hide certain parts of themselves and amplify others. And so, the ego begins to take shape. Here's the key. The ego isn't inherently bad. It's a tool, a structure we need to interact with the world. Without an ego, we'd be like a house with no walls, emotionally exposed to every passing storm. But when this structure becomes rigid, when we stop identifying with our essence and start believing we are only this social and emotional construction, that's when the ego becomes a prison. Think of the ego as an avatar you created to survive childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. It whispers things like, "You're shy, you're strong, you're logical, you can't fail, you have to please others." Many of these beliefs were formed through trauma, repeated experiences, and family patterns. Over time, you stop questioning them. You just are that way, or at least you believe you are. But here's the truth. The ego is an adaptation, not your essence. And because it's an adaptation, it resists anything that threatens its structure. That includes change, growth, uncertainty, the unknown. When you begin to question who you are, or when life demands a transformation, like a new job, the end of a relationship, a search for purpose, or a spiritual awakening, the ego goes into high alert. It screams, "This isn't safe," because change requires letting go of part of the old self. And the ego, deeply tied to our survival instinct, doesn't distinguish between symbolic death and real death. It reacts with fear, defense mechanisms, sabotage, and sometimes even physical symptoms. Anxiety, procrastination, identity crises. This invisible prison becomes more obvious when we realize that even in our unhappiness, we keep repeating the same patterns. We stay in the same draining job, the same toxic relationship, the same self-destructive behaviors. Because for the ego, the familiar is safer than the unknown, even if the familiar hurts. The real danger? Most people mistake the ego for their true identity and spend their entire lives defending a version of themselves shaped by fear, rejection, and the need for approval. In doing so, the ego stops being a bridge and becomes a wall. The key to escaping this prison begins with one powerful question. Who am I beyond what I was told to be? The fear of change, the symbolic death of the ego. Change is scary. Not because change itself is dangerous, but because it forces us to let go of parts of ourselves that, even if dysfunctional, give us a sense of identity and control. The ego, that mental structure built to shape and protect our self-image, sees change as an existential threat. And in a way, it's right, real change is a kind of death. Carl Jung once said that there is no awakening of consciousness without pain. That's because transformation requires us to dismantle what we once believed ourselves to be. When you change, something old has to die. A belief, a story, an identity. And the ego hates to die. It was built to survive. That's why the fear of change isn't just rational. It's visceral. You feel it in your body. Your heart races, your mind sabotages, your body resists. You want to move forward, but something invisible pulls you back. That something is your ego in defense mode. It activates its automatic mechanisms. Denial, procrastination, self-deception, emotional dependency, over-rationalization. That's why so many people say they want to change. But don't, because change isn't just about doing something new. It's about becoming someone new. And that requires mourning the person you used to be. With every real change, a part of you dies, and another must be born. It's what the ancients called an initiatory death, the symbolic passage from an old self to a new being. But unlike literal death, this rebirth only happens if we have the courage to walk through the emptiness between the two. It's in this transition space where the old self no longer fits, but the new one hasn't fully formed, that the greatest fear lives. The fear of nothingness, of having no certainties, of not knowing who you are, of not being accepted, of failing, of getting lost. But this emptiness is not the end. It's a womb, a fertile space where something new can grow, if you have the patience to stay there. Modern society, however, doesn't prepare us for this kind of journey. We're surrounded by messages of instant success, quick transformations, and painless change. But real metamorphosis requires deconstruction. The caterpillar doesn't become a butterfly by skipping steps. It has to completely dissolve inside the cocoon before it can be reborn. The ego must learn how to die so the true self can bloom. Resistance to change, then, isn't a sign of weakness. It's a natural response from a structure terrified of ceasing to exist. But here's the key. The ego doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be repositioned. Instead of master, it can become servant. Instead of prison, a bridge. And that process begins with the willingness to feel fear without letting it paralyze you. To face the void without running. To say, yes, I'm afraid, but I won't let that stop me from being reborn. The traps of an inflated ego, when self-confidence becomes a prison. Self-confidence is an admired trait. Being someone who believes in themselves is seen as a sign of strength, leadership, and emotional intelligence. But there's a fine, almost invisible line between healthy self-confidence and an inflated ego. And once that line is crossed, what was once strength becomes rigidity. What was once clarity turns into arrogance. What was once security becomes a prison. An inflated ego is a mask, an armor built not to express authenticity, but to protect vulnerability. Those who inflate their ego to the extreme are usually trying to hide inner wounds that were never acknowledged. Rejection trauma, unprocessed failures, suppressed insecurities. All of it gets swept under the rug of, I'm strong and don't need to change. But the stronger the ego becomes, the more fragile the person feels inside. The problem is, the inflated ego doesn't listen. It rejects criticism. It refuses to question itself. Can't bear the idea of being wrong, let alone of changing. People stuck in this state develop an aversion to vulnerability, which is the main gateway to growth. In order to protect their self-image, they avoid any situation that might challenge their sense of superiority. Honest feedback, deep conversations, therapy, authentic relationships. This creates a vicious cycle. The more someone avoids the discomfort of self-reflection, the more rigid their ego becomes. And the more rigid it gets, the harder it is to experience real change. It's like an internal fortress. On the outside, it looks impenetrable. But on the inside, it's empty, lonely, and fragile. This is when self-confidence, if not balanced with self-awareness, becomes a prison. The person becomes a slave to their own image. They no longer live to grow, but to maintain a performance. And performances aren't sustainable. Sooner or later, life brings a crisis. A breakup, a financial collapse, a loss, an illness. And when that happens, everything built on the ego crumbles because it had no roots. Eric in his reflections on having versus being, warned about this modern phenomenon. We're so focused on looking like someone that we forget to become someone. The inflated ego feeds on that mindset, appearance, status, control. But the true self only emerges when we're able to let go of the need to always be right, to seem invincible, to never make mistakes. True strength lies in flexibility, in being able to say, maybe I need to change, in listening with humility, in understanding that changing your mind isn't a sign of weakness, it's emotional intelligence. The inflated ego resists this because it believes losing control means losing oneself. But it's precisely in that surrender that the deeper self begins to grow. The challenge, then, is not to eliminate the ego but to integrate it, to re-educate it, to teach it that changing doesn't mean dying, it means evolving. The role of vulnerability in the process of transformation. There's an uncomfortable truth that most people avoid. No deep change happens without vulnerability. Every real transformation demands that, at some point, the armor falls, the mask slips, and the truth comes to light, even if it hurts. And that's exactly where the ego feels the most fear, being exposed. We live in a culture that worships control, performance, and a flawless image. Showing weakness, insecurity, or confusion is often seen as failure. But vulnerability, from a psychological perspective, isn't weakness. It's the fertile ground where real change can finally take root. It's when we allow ourselves to truly feel, to genuinely question, and most of all, to be real. Psychologist Carl Rogers, one of the founders of the humanistic approach, once said, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change." In other words, true transformation only begins when we create space to be exactly who we are, with everything that comes with it. Fears, doubts, contradictions, wounds. Vulnerability is admitting, I don't know. It's having the courage to say, this affects me more than I'd like to admit. It's stopping the performance of strength and, instead, choosing to be honest. And this is where many people get stuck. Because being vulnerable is risky. It means opening yourself up to rejection, criticism, and misunderstanding. But without that risk, there is no growth. Those who don't allow themselves to be touched, don't allow themselves to be transformed. The same shell that protects also suffocates. In therapy, for example, the most profound breakthroughs often happen in the exact moment a person allows themselves to cry, to tell the truth without filters for the first time. Real change doesn't come through intellectualizing. It comes through emotion, when a person connects with their pain without judgment. Brené Brown, a leading researcher on vulnerability, says, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. In other words, if you want to become someone new, you have to be willing to shed the old, and that requires exposure, takes courage, takes presence. The ego tries to convince us that making space for emotions is dangerous, that it's safer to stay in control, stay silent, stay buried. But the truth is, what isn't expressed becomes sickness. Emotional silence turns into anxiety. Self-judgment turns into depression. Emotional rigidity turns into stagnation. It's only through vulnerability that we discover the strength that comes from self-awareness. In that internal space where no masks are needed, we find deeper answers. Sometimes painful, yes, but liberating. To transform is to shed layers. And yes, that hurts. Because for years, you've grown used to being who others expect you to be. But there is a you underneath it all screaming to be born. And that you only emerges when you have the courage to show up as you are, without needing applause, and without fearing judgment. Vulnerability is the womb of change. And if you want to be reborn, you must pass through it. Freeing yourself from the ego, practical paths to conscious change. After exploring the invisible prisons of the ego, its defense mechanisms, the fear of losing identity, and the vital role of vulnerability, we arrive at the key question. How can we actually begin to break free from this inner cage? The good news is, there is a way, but it requires awareness, intention, and persistence. 1. Observe your ego without judgment. The first step is developing what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to observe your own thoughts. Whenever you feel resistance to change, Ask yourself, what exactly am I trying to protect? Maybe it's the fear of looking weak, failing, or losing control. When you name what you're feeling, you begin to loosen the ego's automatic grip. 2. Deconstruct your inner narratives. The ego survives on repeated stories. That's just how I am. I've tried and I just can't. If I change, I'll lose everything. Left unchallenged, these stories become life sentences. But when you start to question them, you often realize that many of these beliefs were inherited from family, society, or trauma. You don't have to keep telling yourself the same story. You can rewrite your emotional biography, and that begins with an honest question. Does this still serve me? 3. Practice letting go of identity attachments. You are not your titles. You are not your job, your follower count, or your appearance. All of that is temporary. The more attached you are to the image you've built, the harder it becomes to grow. Start loosening the grip on the ideal self you've been trying to uphold. Do something outside your comfort zone. Embrace the unknown. Accept that growth hurts, but staying stuck hurts more. 4. Create spaces for silence and introspection. As we explored earlier, without silence, there is no clarity. Practices like meditation, journaling, long walks without external noise, or even unplugging from social media can open inner doors the noise of the world keeps shut. The ego shouts, the soul whispers, and to hear it, you need silence. 5. Accept that change is a process, not a flip of a switch. Change doesn't happen like flipping a light switch. It's more like peeling an onion layer by layer. There will be moments when you step back, feel lost, or doubt yourself. That's part of the journey. The important thing is to not confuse a setback with failure. Every path of transformation has twists and turns. What matters most is staying in motion. Conclusion: your freedom begins where the ego ends. The ego wants you to stay exactly as you are, comfortable, predictable, familiar. But your soul wants to soar. It wants to grow. It wants to breathe new meaning into your life. The choice is yours. Stay chained to the image of who you've always been, or dare to become who you truly are. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these ego traps resonated with you the most? Have you ever felt that fear of change? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might be the spark someone else needs to begin their own transformation. And if this message touched you in any way, consider sharing it with someone still stuck in their own armor. Remember, freedom is an inner construction, and you already have the tools to begin.